Hi everybody. Hi everybody. Why don't we get started? I'm James Heimowitz. I'm the president of China Institute. A big welcome to all of you, which promises to be a very exciting evening. First, I want to give a shout out and a thank you to all the trustees of China Institute who are here tonight. I'll start off with our longest serving, no, I didn't say oldest, longest serving trustee, Yvonne Wong is here, secretary of our board, Ingrid Ehrenberg, second longest serving trustee, Miranda Wong and her husband Hamburg, and our newest trustee, Pete Walker, who has a new book coming out too. So we live in a very tough time now. This is a really scary time, actually, for me personally. I lived in China for 33 years. I consider myself a bicultural person. And I don't think I've ever seen the United States as wary and afraid and anxious about China and things that, China is doing. So there's no question China is on the rise. And that's something that we need to really think about hard. China Institute was founded almost 100 years ago, and we've been through a lot of things. We've watched China go through Cold Wars and revolutions. We've watched them go through, let's say the latest were nationalists, communists, all variety of different political upheaval. And I'm afraid we're in another phase right now. So you didn't come to listen to me, but if you want to come and learn about what's happening in China with a more nuanced and deeper perspective, you've come to the right place. We've got an amazing panel this evening. Thank you to our SVP and Head of Programs, Dinda Elliott, for pulling this all together. They really don't need an introduction, but I just wanted to give one last comment to our moderator, Joe Kong, who's here. I remember in 1986, when I went to China with my dad, and we were meeting, they were thinking about me creating an information office to deal with the Western media. And my dad said to the head of the information office, he said, I really don't get it. He said, the New York Times, I can't access the New York Times in China. What's the problem? Why won't you let us read the New York Times? Back home where I come from in New York, everybody seems to think the New York Times is a communist newspaper anyway. On that note, let me hand it over to our head of programs, Dinda Elliott, and she'll tell you more what's in store this evening.
Dinda Elliott, Director of Programs, as James said, and it is my great honor tonight to introduce two giants in the field of China watching. Orville Schell is a longtime friend and someone I've admired enormously ever since I started covering China back in the 1980s. He's written countless books about China and knows the place better than just about anyone I know. He was also a co-producer of a report about China's influence in America, published by the Hoover Institute last year, which called for constructive vigilance when dealing with Chinese in America. Ezra Vogel has trained more China scholars than I can possibly count. And he has written numerous books about China, including the definitive history of Deng Xiaoping, and most recently, a new book called China and Japan, Facing History. Professor Vogel, where are you, Professor Vogel? There you are, hiding behind the column. Is truly one of my heroes, and the person who in many ways changed the course of my life. I was studying Chinese as a Harvard undergraduate, and Professor Vogel said to me, "You can't study here, you've got to go." The U.S. and China hadn't established diplomatic relations yet, and so I went off to Taiwan, kicking and screaming, I might add, because I really wanted to go to communist China, which I thought was much, much more exciting and much more cool. In Taiwan, though, I was lucky enough to live with a Chinese family and really absorb Chinese culture. And the experience I could never have had in mainland China at the time. The conversation today will be moderated by one of America's leading journalists, Joe Kahn, who is managing editor of the New York Times and speaks fluent Chinese and lived and worked in China for many years as a reporter, so he's a true China expert as well. Finally, I'd like to just add that we're thrilled that SUP China, you see all of these, I said to these guys they're going to feel very important tonight because they've got each two microphones, and that's because SUP China's Sinica podcast is recording this evening's conversation, and we'll run it in 2 weeks, so if anybody wants to listen to the whole thing later, you can do that. I'd also like to mention two important events later this week at China Institute. One, we're opening an immersive Chinese language preschool in 2020. And there will be an informational open house about that this Saturday here at China Institute, when we'll also host the biggest event of our season, Food and Ideas Festival. I'm thinking of it as a kind of a mini New Yorker festival with food thrown in. We will have panels with young Chinese foodies, young green activists from China, including a farmer, literally an organic farmer from China is coming. We have young Chinese designers all talking about the new China. And the big idea behind this Food and Ideas Festival is that there is another China that people need to know, that is not the China of Xi Jinping or the Communist Party or the U.S. China trade war, that there's a whole other China that people need to get to know. We're also going to have rap sensation Wuhan Phoenix, who's going to perform at the party afterwards. So with that, I hope you'll all come to that. Please do. It's going to be a great happening event. And without further ado, let's have the panelists come up to the stage. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think Joe's going to sit on the end. Yeah, it's probably easier for you to moderate that way.
So thank you everyone for joining us. We're just going to kick off the conversation. You all know the topic of tonight's discussion is China the enemy? And I actually thought we could consult an expert on this, an expert who's not on this panel but is in all of our lives every day, the President of the United States, President Trump. Have him help us frame the question for us, because on August 14th, this is what we at the New York Times do, we read the tweets from the President of the United States. On August 14th, he tweeted, "I know President Xi of China very well. He is a great leader who very much has the respect of his own people. He is also a good man and a tough business. I have zero doubt that President Xi wants to quickly and humanely solve the Hong Kong problem, and he can do it. Personal meeting?" Then, exactly 9 days later, he was discussing some problems, both with the trade talks with China and with the Federal Reserve of the United States. And he tweeted, "My only question is, who is our bigger enemy, Jay Powell or Chairman Xi?" So we are going to try to explore which of those two approaches by President Trump feels like it has more resonance these days. And I thought we could start on my far right with Orville Schell, partly because he just returned from China, where he was invited by the Foreign Ministry to discuss the state of the relationship and the sense of rising tensions on both sides. So, Orville, maybe you could kick us off just by talking about your trip there and some of your reflections on the state of the relationship.
Well, I think we'd have to say that, you know, if you look at the sort of the sweep of the last 10 or 20 years, the relationship is probably at a relatively low ebb and teetering in ways. It's hard to exactly say which way it will go. My feeling of being there at this time is that there is starting to be a whole host of uncertainty sort of gathering over the Chinese leadership. And I think that's partially caused by President Trump, who in all, I think, deference to him, did recognize that the relationship was out of balance and did need to be adjusted if it was going to be successful and endure. And I think that is kind of essentially a paradigm shift, if you will. And the sense I get in China is that they have, at this particular moment, with the public dialogue so stilled, there is a rather diminished ability to talk to themselves, to hear themselves, and to hear criticisms and to try to formulate a new way out. I think there is an actual desire and will to do that now, recognizing that things are, as I said, teetering. So I think that is my predominant question. They recognize it's not just the U.S. China relationship, but that China's posture in the world too is calling a lot of questions to the fore, and they're not quite sure how to deal with that. And that's probably a healthy thing. But I also would have to say that in all the years I've been going to China, and I first went in 1975, I have rarely seen a time when there are few sort of ruminative voices in the public sphere. And I think that is quite a disadvantage.
Does China have a policy now to manage the signals of a stronger or harder line American policy, or do you think they're still struggling to find?
Well, this is something we may want to talk about in a little greater detail. I think the conceit of the last few decades was engagement. And that presupposed that the U.S. and China, even though very different, were slowly converging in crucial ways. And I think one of the things that's happened in the last few years is many people in this country now think we're diverging. So this makes it very difficult for us to know how to exactly comport ourselves in relationship to each other. And I think we're struggling to find a new balance, even at the same time that I think China recognizes that something has to be done, or this ship could go down.
Ezra, let me turn to you. You are one of the lead authors on an influential op-ed that appeared not too long ago in the Washington Post, and which is not to hold anything against it. And the title was "China is not an enemy." Tell us a little bit about why you were involved with that effort and what your most important takeaways from that are.
In the last couple of years, the Washington mood has grown so anti-Chinese, and the politicians are all jumping on China, and the people who want to serve in future administrations are joining the bandwagon. And so there is just a terrible mood, and the Chinese know it, and a lot of people in China who are friendly with the West and open-minded feel that America is treating them like an enemy. And if we treat them like an enemy, that gives strength to the people who are ultra-patriotic in China. And we can become more enemies, and that's scary. A lot of us who work on China immediately responded, that's not right, and there's not a consensus, it's not united. But we were not organized, we didn't know quite how to go about that. And so a lot of us began discussing and exchanging emails. And in the end, 5 of us, 2 former diplomats, State Roy, who was one of our great ambassadors, grew up in Nanjing, graduated from Princeton, advises Kissinger. When Kissinger wants to know what's going on in China, he calls David Roy on the phone. And he served as ambassador for several years, and then back in Washington. So he was one of those. Another was an academic, Taylor Fravel, who has just written what I think is the best work on Chinese military strategy. He's been working on that for many years. He's a professor at MIT. Another is Mike Swain, who has been working for another 40 years on China. He's working defense, and he's a key think tank, Carnegie in Washington. And then there was a woman who worked in the State Department and just resigned. And she also joined in. She was in charge of the China Bureau, the East Asia Bureau of the State Department, although she never was fully confirmed. And she finally couldn't take it and retired. And the I is representing an academic. So we feel that we wanted to make the point Washington is united, and certainly not all are united. The United States treats China as enemy, and China is strong in a lot of things we don't like. The term I would like to use is rival. They are rival. And they're an economic rival, they're a political rival, they're an ideological rival, and we do need to rival. But we need to keep it in bounds. We in Boston think of the Red Sox as our team. And you people are New Yorkers, you all think of Yankees and other teams as your team. We can play sports, but it's within a league, and it's within boundaries. And if the Yankees get better, then it prods us to try to behave better, to do better. That's the kind of rivalry we need, but it needs to be bounded, not by this all-out, unpredictable antagonism, which can really lead to conflict.
Orville, you were involved in another recent effort, a comprehensive effort to look at the range of Chinese influence, soft power, if you will, in the United States and in other Western countries, looking at the spread of Chinese influence or attempts to influence into academia, think tanks, into making friends with politicians and business community as well. And among your conclusions was that the rest of the world needed to be far more vigilant to China. In that sense, and that was a Hudson Institute report, do you come away from that effort believing that the rhetoric that China may be an enemy is more harmful or perhaps more helpful to at least increasing vigilance? I mean, how do you reflect on that?
I mean, I think the word enemy is not the right word because it presupposes that it's sort of the end of the game. There's nothing to be done. I think we've gotten to this state where this is even arising. It's almost like watching a Greek tragedy unfold, where you can see what's happening, where the leaders can't rise to the occasion. There's a certain amount of overweening arrogance and ambition on each side, and you just head towards the cliff and over you go. And I think I just spent the summer looking through the last 7 presidential administrations and their policies towards China. And one of the things that's really impressed me about it is that every single president since Nixon, American president, has leaned over backwards to make this relationship work. Now, Clinton came in talking about the butchers from Beijing to Baghdad, but he went out with pulling China into the WTO and giving them the permanent most favored nation standing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you look at this record and you wonder, how did we get to where we are today? And I think actually it was a sort of badly played game by both sides. But here we are, where opportunities were missed to level things out before they got antagonistic. And now they've gotten antagonistic enough where we have this situation Ezra mentions of a bipartisan sense of China as a rival, a competitor, and possibly an enemy. And that is because this very critical notion that we could engage each other, which is what Kissinger and Nixon, bless their hearts, started in 1972. We could set certain things aside. We could get along with this country that was different politically, with different values, because there were other compelling reasons. And that's what's been lost. And I'm not sure how we get back to it, particularly under Trump, but I think also here it would be interesting for us to look at what each side did and didn't do, which brought us to this impasse. And there's plenty of blame to share on both sides.
So we'll have a chance to review a bit of what both of you think might have gone well or might have gone wrong in the past. But let me take you up briefly, if you don't mind, on your reference to a Greek tragedy. In one sense, because one of Ezra's colleagues at Harvard, Graham Allison, has referred to the U.S. China relationship as following, a kind of Greek tragic path, the Thucydides trap, which was a reference to Athens and Sparta, and then to the many great power rivalries that have emerged over the centuries since then, and the possibility or even the probability of war breaking out at some But Graham Allison's somewhat counterintuitive take is that when two great powers, or when an incumbent power facing a rising power, actually start to think of each other as enemies and game around each other as enemies, the chances of conflict may be reduced because they are very aware of the other threat. That's the Cold War situation and the nuclear paradox. But do you at least acknowledge the possibility that with both sides being far more vigilant about potential threats in the relationship that they were before, that you might avert the worst outcome? Or do you think that by beginning to think of each other as enemies, we actually heighten the possibility of that outcome?
Can I interrupt 1 second? Graham Allison is a friend of mine, and when I talked to him about his idea, I said to him, Graham, you've made it very clear that there's a real danger that we might get in trouble. And his title of the book did not end in a question mark. It should have ended in a question mark, because he doesn't really believe that the conflict is inevitable. He really believes that there are a lot of things that can be done to avoid that, and he wants to work to avoid that.
Yes.
So I just want to defend my colleagues.
Ezra, can you make sure to hold your mic up when you speak? Yeah.
Well, I share your sentiment, Ezra. I mean, I think it's not inevitable. But in order to head off what is definitely a bad trend line, it seems to me we need some really good leadership. And I think in different ways, each side is lacking such leadership right now. We all don't need to labor what's going on in America. We all understand that and see it. And I think China, too, has, it lacks the kind of flexibility that it once afforded itself. I mean, I think particularly back to the 80s. I mean, I've been on many presidential trips, and I'll never forget the one with Bill Clinton, because you watched him with Jiang Zemin. This was after he came in breathing fire against China. And their body language, their obvious pleasure in interacting with each other was very telling. And they actually, that was an amazing time. After 1989, less than a decade had passed, and the U.S. and China did come back together with some modicum of being able to feel that they could work together. And then you look at what goes on with Xi Jinping. I went on a trip with Trump and Xi Jinping. I mean, there was none of that. Whatever Trump says about their friends is actually good, because that means they're not maligning each other and trashing each other. But there was no sense of let's figure this out together. There's no sense that the leadership could actually break the stranglehold of what has been going on and reset the terms of the game. And I have to say, I think in this regard, to be critical of the Chinese side for a minute, many, many opportunities were missed with very reasonable, sane administrations in Washington begging China to level the playing field. And China didn't respond as I think it could have, and would have headed off a lot of what's happening now, which is triply hard to fix under Trump because he's very unpredictable.
So Ezra, looking back across the many years that you've been studying China, speaking with Chinese officials at all stage in their development, from the very earliest opening to the West to the present day, do you emerge from the feeling that China is confident that it can and would like to replace the United States as the dominant power in the world? Or do you think there is still a fundamental ambivalence and question about that, even in the minds of the Chinese who you speak with?
I wouldn't say ambivalence, because I think they would like to be stronger. They would like to be the leading country in the world. But I think uncertainty. I sense that now
Ezra, can you hold the mic up a little bit? Yeah.
they really are not sure of what they can do and where they're at. And I think what Orville just found out in Beijing is an example of that uncertainty. And the United States is also not responding in a way that they can really work out problems. It's not just the White House. It's that we're not using our State Department in an effective way. We're not having discussions with their leaders. It's a very broad base. 20 years ago, I think nobody believed that China would go this fast. Even in China, I think they were not confident. But now that they have continued to rise so rapidly, that their GNP, if not already bigger, will soon be bigger than ours, that they have more trade with other countries in the world than we do, that they are spending far more on infrastructure around the world than we are. They have already, in some ways, already begun to replace the United States. And I think that the United States reaction is serious. You know, we've never been replaced before. And I've just gone through studying Japan-China relations. And when China replaced Japan, I would date it from 2008 to 2012-14. They had an extremely tense period. I think we're now going through a period when China is probably going to be a bigger economy. It already has, as I say, has more trade, more investment around the world, and its growing political impact around the world. And the United States is not used to that. And we don't know what China's going to be like. And when China builds up its military, and when it mistreats its own people in Xinjiang, a lot of people in the West are very frightened that it could be really terrible. My own view is that they're not like the Soviet Union. They're not like Hitler wanting to invade other countries. They haven't shown signs of invasion, but they do want to be a strong and respected nation that has great influence. But now suddenly they're close to it, and they see signs that maybe they aren't there, and they're not sure. And they find reaction in Hong Kong and Washington and Europe and Canada and Australia, around the world. And so I think there's great new uncertainty.
Well, let me, you raised the comparison of Japan, and you were very focused on Japan in the late 70s and the 80s, when Japan was also seen by some in the United States as an emerging rival and potentially even in some circles seen as an enemy. How similar do you think the two situations are? Japan in the 80s and China in the second decade of the 21st century?
I think people who grew up after the 80s don't realize how tense the relationship was in the 80s with Japan. There were books written about Japan as the enemy, and there was real fear that they were going to overtake us industrially. But this situation now is much worse and much more widespread than it was with Japan. First of all, Japan at that time was our military ally. And the people who wanted to keep the alliance against the Soviet Union right up until the early 90s were ready to work with Japan against the Soviet Union. And also, Japan did not have 1.4 billion people. And it did not have a tremendous stretch of people around the world. And after World War II, I think Japan lost that drive to really dominate the world. I think the experience in the 1930s of feeling so confident they could do so much, and then came disaster. I think Japan, in spirit, was still wounded by that. But I think China now feels, you know, they were an ancient great power. They were not a world power, they were the Asia power. But they see now what they can do and the speed of their growth and the size of their intellectual group, the size of the universities, the growth of their people around the world. And I think there is a greater ambition, a greater stretch, and it will go much further. When the crash came in Japan in 1989, that was the end. And by 3 years later, almost nobody was worried about Japan.
Right.
But it's hard to imagine that will happen with China. It could run into a lot of problems, but it still has so much economic power and military power that Japan in the 80s did not have.
So, Orville, let me ask you about one aspect of that power, which is that some people in China anyway, and perhaps some others around the world, but this is the basis of the question, see that China actually has a fairly comprehensive model or alternative to American hegemony and the American system of free markets and democracy and human rights. And it crosses into the political realm, cultural, economic, social, a way of organizing society. Do you see the potential, maybe even regardless of how the relationship is managed, that you'll see the world begin to diverge into those who prefer the Chinese authoritarian model versus those who see America as the world leader?
You know, that's a really interesting question, Joe, and I think that it's the crux of part of what we're talking about, because they haven't actually declared themselves as a model, but there's a word in Chinese that's been used, the 中国方案, the China solution, option, something of that notion. And I think why that's particularly significant is because if you begin to look at China as an alternative system and an alternative universe, then you have to also look at what is it all about. What's its political structure? What's its value structure? How does it operate? Is this the kind of thing that you feel comfortable with having elaborated and spread around the world? And I think that with that sort of hint, maybe that China had arrived at some sort of an alternative way to be in the world. It wasn't just in transition towards a nice, liberal, more democratic, open society model somewhere in the future. That got particularly alarming to people. And so here, the critical element, I think, in our relationship with China and why domestic politics in China really matter is that if you lose the element of political reform, which China basically has, you lose that capacity to believe that it's evolving towards some more congenial, digestible, absorbable model that would converge with what we accept as sort of should be the norm. Whether that's right or not is another question. So that's a really important question. You lose reform, you actually lose the logic of engagement. Because what does engagement presuppose? It presupposes that we're different, but we're going to slowly come together if we just keep up the interaction.
Right. Ezra, you've mentioned, both of you in fact mentioned the leadership question, and one of your lifetime achievements is the definitive biography of Deng Xiaoping, who was obviously instrumental in taking China decisively in a new direction in the late 1970s and through the 80s. We now have a very different Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, who arguably is the most powerful leader since Deng, or some say the most powerful leader since Mao. How do you reflect on his ability to take China in a fundamentally different direction? Do you think he has the leeway to do that the way Deng Xiaoping did back in the 80s?
I don't see him as the most powerful leader, and I don't see him as more powerful than Deng. Deng came to power after a lifetime studying and working and full of experiences. He spent 5 years in France. He spent 1 year in the Soviet Union. He spent 3 years running the Southwest just at the time it was establishing power throughout the country with about 100 million people under him. He served 10 years in Beijing as the General Party Secretary. He was one of the leading people in the army for 12 years, and in the end, in the Huai campaign, he ended as the political commissar for 500,000 troops. He was a military hero. So, and he worked closely with Mao and closely with Zhou Enlai. The last 2 years of Zhou Enlai's death, when he had cancer, he really put Deng Xiaoping in charge of foreign policy, and they worked very closely together. So Deng had an amazing breadth, and as I say, the experience in Beijing of 10 years running the party when he had come, and he was also in charge of economic matters as well. So here is Xi Jinping. It's true that he comes from a well-known family, but he never worked in Beijing. He was not in the, he had no important role in the army. He had no experience at running things. He hasn't lived abroad. He didn't had experience working in foreign policy. He's a guy who worked in the province. He lived in the Cultural Revolution. He didn't have good university training either because he went to schools during the Cultural Revolution. He was down in the countryside. So he comes to Beijing. And unlike Deng Xiaoping, who could be a relaxed person in charge, spend the morning reading papers, and in the evenings he could watch television and play with his grandkids. Xi Jinping has to grab everything into his own self. So what you see is leading groups under Xi Jinping. So to people who don't know the background and context, it looks as if Xi Jinping is very strong because they have this leading group and head of that group. And he has replaced a lot of the people who were in Beijing with people who worked under him in Fujian or Hebei or someplace else. So they're indebted to him. They have to look to him. So they do look to him, and their power depends on serving Xi Jinping. So he has a tight group on that small, but that's not the breadth and depth of Deng Xiaoping, who had a very broad strategic sense. I remember when I talked to Lee Kuan Yew about Deng, and I said, Deng came to Singapore with his foreign ministry people. He must have taken their advice. He said, oh no, they looked at Deng Xiaoping. He knew more about foreign policy than they did. Xi Jinping is not that way. He looks strong, he acts strong, he's in charge of a lot of leading groups, but that does not give him the breadth and depth of strength that Deng had.
So
Is the corollary of that then that he also doesn't have the leeway or the ability to make a really decisive shift in direction on the Chinese side, in other words, that he would need to build a much broader leadership consensus compared to the way Deng Xiaoping operated in those days?
I don't think he could make a strong decision that is different from what others felt. I think there was a decision at the time he was selected to be the head, that China needs a more forceful leader rather than Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, because they really need to crack down on corruption. They really needed to be tough, and he was prepared to be tough. So he was given a certain leeway to be tough and to crack down. But I don't think that gives him the leeway to give a whole new direction of policy. China is a huge bureaucracy. They have a lot of talented people who have a lot of experience and know-how. Mao Zedong, was above the clouds. Deng Xiaoping could do things, but Xi Jinping is a leading leader, and he doesn't have that independent leeway. And to me, he looks like somebody who's acting tough and strong, but doesn't have as firm and a solid base as Deng Xiaoping had.
Orville, let me see if I can get you to take up how a similar question looks on the U.S. side. We have a president who declares himself to be a stable genius and implementing all the levers of power. Do you think he has the ability to significantly shift the tone in U.S. China relations, or do you think that there is more of a tectonic shift occurring here in the United States that would make it harder for him to do that than a single declaration might suggest?
I mean, I think the tragedy of our situation here in America is that Trump has that kind of animal instinct that smelled out the inequity in our relationship with China, the lack of reciprocity, the imbalances, all of these things you know about. But he has almost no capacity then, having gotten the attention of the Chinese leadership, which I think he most emphatically has done, of converting that into any constructive new format. And what the relationship now needs, in my view, it needs a post-engagement engagement strategy. But this isn't Trump's thing. And he's got a lot of people in the White House who they're loaded for bear and decoupling the relationship So if that's where you're headed, then it's very hard to want to fix it. And then, you know, you have what Ezra just said about Xi Jinping, that he just isn't the kind of guy who just smiles and says, come on, we can fix this, let's get to work here. I think he's very cautious. He really wants to appear to be sort of the strong leader, but I'm not sure he has that kind of self-confidence that would allow him to. I mean, Deng was amazing, actually, and if he hadn't gotten laid low by 1989, I actually think China would be a very, very different place.
Ezra, you're going to jump in.
I agree so much with Orville that I hesitate to find differences.
I'm trying to get you to disagree.
But you said post-engagement. I think the engagement strategy was much more successful than most people do.
I agree, but I still think we're heading over the edge. I think it was the right thing to do, and I think it showed great leadership on the American side. I even think when President Bush the first sent Scowcroft to Beijing after the Beijing massacre and got soundly criticized, by myself included, looking back on it now,
He was right.
He was right. He was right. That's what leadership does. It keeps tension on the line, even when things are getting really rough. But I don't think right now it's going to be very easy to right the ship.
I agree with that, but I just wanted to defend what engagement accomplished.
You can't make me into an enemy there.
I wouldn't even make you into a rival for that. But I think it's true that the amount of contacts, the number of people in China who have a broad view of the world and who are cosmopolitan and want to work with others is much greater. One thing I disagreed with that article that Kurt Campbell and Ratner wrote was they said it didn't work and that we needed, it changed things enormously. And we need to continuously engage things. The world is now so intertwined. To think we can deal with the world's climate issues or the world's trade structure or the United Nations structure without China, without coming to some kind of fundamental agreement with them, it's impossible. And we have to continue to be engaged. Maybe you don't disagree.
No, I don't disagree. I think engagement was right, but I think for reasons we've been discussing, it's not worked. And so the question is, how do we breathe life back into it?
I do disagree because I think it did work.
Oh no, I think it worked in the past. I think it's not working for us now.
We need, China is stronger. They're more assertive. They've done things the way they've treated American businessmen, the way they've treated journalists. We need to be firm, and we need to defend ourselves from spying, and without making things so difficult for Chinese students. And it's a very difficult thing I think we're facing now. How, as an American democracy that's open, we deal with a country that makes it difficult and takes advantage without being fully reciprocal. And it's going to be a very difficult thing that we're going to have to continue working on.
Let me challenge you both on one question related to the legacy of engagement, which is picking up on something that Orville said. Do you believe that the engagement strategy as it was pursued from the 80s and the 90s really through the first decade of the 21st century was at least partly based on an American assumption that there would be a degree of convergence between the United States and China, a degree of economic convergence, and ultimately political openness, if not total convergence. That engagement was based at least on an optimistic view that the two civilizations were not fundamentally different, and that as it became clearer, to both sides really, that they were on a more separate course, and Orville, you referred to a decoupled course, that engagement just became much harder politically to defend on either side. How do you respond to that?
I think that there was some optimism, and perhaps some over-optimism. But I think that most of us who worked on China didn't expect that China would end up being exactly like the United States, be somewhat different. But I think China has changed, and I think today is not the end of history. To say that China now has gone back and has tight control over freedom of speech, do we think that will last forever? Unfortunately, I won't live to see if it lasts maybe 10, 20
Could you speak
years.
louder, please? Sorry.
But I do believe that there are many Chinese who are not happy with having this tight control over information in China. When you have 1.5 million Chinese abroad as students, when you have 8 million Chinese visiting Japan every year, and when they go abroad to different countries, they can get full information. How are you going to have tight control over information? In wartime, in a previous era, before internet and before interaction and travel, it might be possible to have tight control. But I think what China is trying to do with tight control now is not the end of history. And maybe I'm an old-fashioned optimist, but I see a lot of Chinese who are not happy with that, and who are getting a lot of information outside of the regular channels. And I don't think that's going to go away, and I don't think that China can forever have the tight control over information they're trying to do right now.
Orville, how do you feel about that question? Is there a needed sense of optimism in order for the two sides to re-engage?
You know, I share Ezra's sort of cautionary word that we forget we are in a flow of history, and we've all been watching this relationship in the country for a long time, and the openness factors have waxed and they've waned, and they will continue to do so. So we're not at the end of anything. And one of the sort of most striking impressions of this past trip was in talking to friends and colleagues and officials. I mean, I don't think there was a single one with whom we met privately who was particularly enamored of what's going on in the policy world. They're far too sophisticated, smart, cosmopolitan to feel comfortable with that. Now, that's a kind of a strange discontinuity between top and bottom, but look at our own country. I mean, we have a similar phenomenon of a different kind. I do think that, in answer to your question, Joe, that, I mean, just remembering back to the 1980s, I mean, which was an extraordinary period, you remember, we were all in and out of China then. There was a presumption amongst a lot of Chinese that reform was the elixir that was going to transform this country not only into being more wealthy and powerful and proud of itself, but also was going to politically change it. And you remember all of the projects. They asked President Jimmy Carter to come in and launch a whole project on village elections. And then when Xi Jinping came to power, they asked him kindly to stop it. So, I mean, right there you had a kind of a sense. So it wasn't sheer naivete on the part of us with our Hegelian dreams of the end of history and Fukuyama land as the ultimate paradise to which we were all evolving. I think there was an actual belief that China was changing in China itself. And that was a good thing, and it engendered a great deal of optimism in the relationship.
Yeah. We're going to open it up to questions from you all shortly, but let me just turn to one thing that's been very much in the news recently that goes to that point, which is the situation in Hong Kong today and the extended protests on the street in Hong Kong. And it does seem that many of the young people who have turned out for these protests are caught in the midst of a similar ambiguous question about whether they feel a tight enough bond to mainland China or whether they're searching for a different identity outside of Xi Jinping's definition of what it means to be Chinese. And it's exactly 30 years ago that a group of students led by students in Beijing were going through a similar dilemma. Do you see parallels between those, and how do you both feel about the challenge to China posed by the students on the street in Hong Kong? Students and young workers and others.
I think that the Hong Kong is such a tragedy, and those of us who go to Hong Kong, those of us who go to Hong Kong often feel it's such a tragedy that so many talented people feel that they can't put up with the future of the mainland. And the leaders in Beijing cannot be too open with Hong Kong, because if they do, then they will be facing demands for action inside China. As Chinese leaders look at what happened in Russia, it fell apart. Eastern Europe fell apart. And it fell apart sometimes when they were being too generous and too open. So it's understandable why some leaders feel that under threat or under strain, you have to clamp down and keep tight control. I think a lot of people in China can accept that when you got 1.4 billion people of such diverse background, I mean, Europe can't even hold together, they can't even keep Britain, and Spain can't even hold together. So how 1.4 billion? And I think that the people in Hong Kong are feeling that they don't want that future. They like what they have. They have a freedom and an openness, and they would like to preserve that. Unfortunately, the 50-year is coming pretty fast.
Ezra, can you hold the mic up?
Did I?
Yeah,
Not hold it
okay.
right. So the people in Hong Kong are really terribly worried about their future. But, 50 years with the end of the two systems agreement. And I think China is just going to try to wait it out and try to avoid. I think China mishandled it. I think the things that they could have done to give Hong Kong more freedom to manage it better and to have more voting. But I think it's going to be a very tough job to put them back together again now.
Orville, how do you see China getting out of this Hong Kong problem at the moment? Can they get out of it?
I remember so clearly being in Hong Kong in 1997 and being on endless panels, and of course the question came up, will one country, two systems work? And at the time I was very skeptical, because the value systems were so different, the structures were so different, everything was different. And yet, it went along well enough for a fair amount of time. And I think it began to unravel when China began to nibble away at those sort of, yes, there was some lack of clarity about whether they'd allow, elections for the Legislative Council to be popular or continue the system they have now. But I think that was a fatal mistake, because if they just left it alone, nobody would have noticed, Hong Kong would have gone on. But remember that the presumption behind the handover, when Britain signed the agreement with China in 1984, and then turned Hong Kong over in 1997, the reason why people thought 50 years was good enough, because almost everybody believed that by 50 years' time, China would have changed so radically that Hong Kong would just love to be part of it. And that also was the great hope among many of us, I think, for Taiwan. That just don't fight. Just leave it be until China reforms and changes, and then Taiwan will naturally find that its economic interest makes it logical to join up. And that's where I think the whole political reversal in the last 5-6 years or so has cast a different shadow on Hong Kong and on Taiwan.
So on that note, let's see what colleagues in the audience, what's on your mind. We're happy to, should we pass around a microphone, or people are just, okay. So there's one right here on the right. We can start with you.
Please identify yourself.
My name is Jeffrey Tao. I'm a freelance interpreter. The impression that I get reading the press is that during these past few years, when there have been rising tensions between the US and China, that seems to have driven China and Russia closer together than before. To some extent, they're building on an old relationship which didn't work out, but there seems to be some kind of a revival economic, commercial, investment, and military cooperation is growing apace. And watching Chinese TV, I get the impression that they are still grateful to the Russians for their assistance on cultural issues like music, ballet, and art, and literature. How should we, as Americans, be viewing this trend? Should we be worried? Is there some way we can benefit from this? In the UN Security Council, the Russians and the Chinese almost always vote together. How should we be tackling this?
I think Russia and China have plenty of problems. And of course now the situation is so different from the Sino-Soviet alliance. In the days of the Sino-Soviet alliance, it was the Soviet Union that was strong, and Japan was studying from the Soviet. China was, somebody works on China and Japan, both of you. China and the Soviet Union, had a really big quarrel, and I don't think the results of that quarrel have dissipated entirely. But it's also true that even after they split, that old Soviets, and you could go to a Chinese park in Beijing on Sunday and hear a lot of people singing old Soviet songs that remember the good old days. I think that culture from the Soviet Union didn't go away. I think now the Soviet Union, frankly, in most areas is not a major player. And I think that the United States and China have plenty to worry about, and I wouldn't put the Sino-Soviet cooperation as high on that list to worry about.
I'll just say quickly two things. One, isn't it a great paradox that the great experiment in U.S.-China engagement began in 1972 as an anti-Soviet enterprise? And now here we are with the Sino-Soviet alliance reviving. The second thing I'd say is this. I think what actually ties China together, and believe me, Chinese, they call the Russians, Lao Mao, not very flattering. They don't really like the Russians, and the Russians don't really like the Chinese. So it's a marriage of opportunity, and I think they're bound together by a sense of grievance. They both feel that the West, or the great powers, whatever's out there, is trying to strip their empires, break them up, engage in regime change, disesteems their governments, looks down on their value systems, and I think it's very galling to them, and I think that gives them a certain fraternal relationship.
Other questions? Here, sir.
Yeah, Peter Walker. I'm a retired McKinsey director. I've made maybe 80 to 90 trips to China over the last 15 years. So I'd like to put out a hypothesis. One is that the Chinese governments have always served with the support of the people. And whenever they've lost that support, there's been regime change, never model change, going back for many years. So my question is, does China really need to do anything differently from the path they're on? So if you look at the strength of their economy, which is increasingly driven by a growing middle class, if you look at their position vis-a-vis technology, where they're investing far more than we are in a very coordinated way, and if you look at their engagement with the rest of the world, Africa, developing countries, increasingly Europe, does China need the U.S. going forward?
I think it's true that the Chinese have been very successful in technology and international relations and building. I think the Belt and Road has been much more successful, and that we should have joined it. I think that the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank is something we should have joined in the early part and work. But I think that still China has to worry about slowing growth rate. And if you look what happened in Japan and South Korea and other countries, they grew very fast, the late industrializing countries, when they built infrastructure and steel. And when that began to slow down, the growth rate begins to go down, and there are so many unmet needs in China. I think the Chinese leadership is very worried about all the things that can happen. And there are a lot of people who want more democracy, more discussion. It's true that they can do much better than we can with infrastructure, and they can build better roads, better subways, better highways, better fast-speed trains. But still, I think there's a longing for greater discussion. I was quite surprised that we at Harvard and other American universities have not had a big drop-off in applicants from China this year. There are, as confident as Chinese are about things, they still want to come to the United States to study, and not a small number would like to live here. So I think that there are a lot of problems in China.
You know, I think in answer to your question, do they need us? Well, China in this incarnation has had a long history of autarky and total independence from the West and from the United States, and it can do it. And people are just taking their belts. But it's not an ideal scenario. And the truth is that the relationship with the United States, through engagement, was an incredible asset for China, and it enabled China to join the global marketplace. And I think America, in all fairness, played a very constructive role in that. I mean, there are some slips, yes. So can they do without it? Well, sure. But the question I ask is, why would they want to? And if you look back at the derailment of our relationship, and there are many reasons, we've discussed some of them tonight, you have to ask yourself, how is it conceivably in China's interest to break engagement or to play any role in sort of dismantling engagement when it was so advantageous to China? And I believe it still is. And it would be a sorry world if we turned into adversaries, much less enemies. We were doing reasonably well. We were limping along, but we were doing okay. So I think it is a great failure of both governments that we have put a stake through the heart of engagement. Here, I guess I disagree a little with Ezra. I think you still hope it has some life in it. I actually do too, but I don't see a whole lot. And I don't quite know how to get back to it.
I think we in the university do see a lot more exchange, and we do see a lot of life in it. And even when we go to China, then we meet friends. Well, you were there recently. You had some good talks with good friends. But I think it's not only that the world is so small that China needs us, but we need China now. The idea of decoupling is impossible. I mean, the communication, the intricacies of production networks are now so complex, you can't pull them apart anymore. And even if the governments try, it's not going to work. I mean, there are too many people who can think of ways to, something can be done better someplace else, and it's going to happen. And so I think we just have to work together to deal with that complexity.
There's another question just in front here.
In de-escalating this crisis situation, you've been alluding to this, but how constrained do you think both leaders are by their own domestic concerns about what they need to do with the rise of nationalism in both countries and staying in power themselves, and how is that restraining them?
Well, I think they feel quite constrained. But again, I mean, I don't want to overemphasize sort of big leader culture here, but real leaders lead. They don't just follow. I mean, I was not a supporter of Richard Nixon, but damn, he got in there and changed the game. And that's what Deng Xiaoping did. He didn't say, do I have a market here? Should I do a survey? Should I, take a poll? No. He came in with guns blazing, and he turned the whole China supertanker right around. And I think we don't see that now. I mean, Trump has a tiny little piece of it in his pugnaciousness in confronting China, but that's only one piece of this big puzzle. So I don't know. I look back at the people who made a real difference, and they were people who were unrepentant in their belief that it needed to be different, and confident enough in their own ability to the devil take the hindmost, they were going to do it.
I agree with that.
A question here. Hold, just wait for a mic.
Thank you. I'm Sunny Wong from New Jersey, and I'm from the enterprise. My question is, the world is often divided geopolitically into West and East. During the G8 summit in Paris, the president of France says the West side is now facing a challenge, is going down, while the East part is rising. So do you think the rising of the East, including China, is a major cause of the West getting ill or descending, including the United States? Do you think the civilization clashes will be true?
I don't believe the civilization clashes are the real source of the problem. I see so many Chinese who have absorbed so much of Western culture, and I think it's over real problems. It's the real rise of China and the power. I think 20 years ago, the person from McKinsey may have a different view, a lot of Western companies were quite optimistic and would accept giving up some technology. But now that China is so strong, they say, woo, we've got to be stronger, and we have to fight back in a much stronger way. I don't think that change is because of cultural differences. I think it's the real power of China that has changed the situation.
Yes, back here, if you don't mind passing the mic.
Hi, my name is Esther Han. I'm a Mandarin teacher. I want to talk about the word to brainwash. Mr. Vogel mentioned, Chinese people, there are a certain number of Chinese people travel abroad and a certain number of international students. I recently learned to brainwash was introduced into English from Chinese, like kowtow and gung ho. So personally, I found it very frustrating because I don't think the commoners, the real Chinese people, not the Chinese people here, the elite ones, the commoners, they have been brainwashed so thoroughly. I don't think they can be inquisitive. Even the international students here, I often find them, they are here just for the degrees. In the 80s, they are inquisitive of Western civilization. They want to know the West. And that's why there was this Tiananmen massacre. But nowadays, I don't see that they have that humbleness, they have the humility to learn from other civilizations. So perhaps my question is, Mr. Vogel, were you being too optimistic about Chinese people's inquisitiveness? Thank you.
I think the Chinese are still learning, and I am impressed with the number of Chinese. Take a field like public health. I have some friends who advise the Chinese government, and the number of people they send abroad to learn about public health, about high technology. I think there's tremendous inquisitiveness. I think if you'd gone to China in 1967 and seen those red cards, you would say, it's impossible. These people have been brainwashed, there's nothing we can do. Deng Xiaoping comes along in 1978, and it's fundamentally changed. So I don't think they're brainwashed. I mean, they do have public opinion, they do have sentiment. It's true that a lot of people in China, for example, now think that the Hong Kong demonstrators are being too bold and we should listen to the government. They think that we need those Uyghur camps to keep those people under control. I think those people would accept that now, but under a new leader, I agree with Orville, leaders can make a difference and a whole new perspective. And I think there are a lot of wise Chinese who would be ready to follow a new leader under new conditions. I really don't see that they're going to be able to keep the tight control over information that they have now. And people aren't that brainwashed. They're not going to stay the way that. They know when they have to be quiet and avoid getting in trouble. But that doesn't mean that they've been brainwashed.
Thank you. All right, in the back here, if I can get a mic.
Hi, Tom Moore from the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. You seem to keep talking about what China has been doing wrong, what China is not doing right. I think that this is, in many ways, our failure just to recognize that China will become probably the #1 power. 1.4 billion people are not going away. There are 4 times as many of them as there are of us. And if we keep our immigration policies as current, we'll probably continue to grow much faster than we will. But when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, we moved very quickly as a nation to enter into the space race and go forward. Meanwhile, today, we're watching China build up its infrastructure, build up all of these things, letting our education collapse and everything else. Why aren't we saying more to the United States, patient heal or doctor heal yourself? And I'd like to know really what you feel that, why, is this more of the United States just not facing up to its own responsibilities and really stepping up to the plate?
Well, I think there's a huge quotient of that. Alas, we are deputized as China specialists, so we don't have licenses to be critical of our own country, but we do it anyway. I think you're absolutely right. We're defaulting in 1,000 different ways. In a certain sense, China is being blamed because we don't have anybody competing in 5G. So we're going to try to push Huawei off the board. That said, there are other problems in the relationship. So yes, the primary principle of Confucianism is, turn to yourself. Look at your own problems first. And that's something Americans of late have not been very good at.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm Raymond Zhou, and
The mic's coming.
so I have a question. Today, I think we are talking about China is China's enemy. A lot of things based on past experience, and also we project future based on some speculation, right? So I think let's make a bold speculation. So today we say, because the talk actually is about between China and the U.S., but the people sitting here, actually I think we're talking about the U.S. So let's think about China-U.S. China's enemy, let's suppose, put that assumption away, but say China is an enemy, and the U.S. has the power to get rid of it. So we wipe China out of the earth, and that will solve U.S. problem. So what is the U.S. problem? The biggest challenge. And after China, and will this challenge be removed together? So that's my question, and I hope I can some speculation from our guests on the stage.
Well, I find it hard to relate to. China's not going away, and it's going to remain, and we're going to remain. And if we solve our China problem, as Orville said, we still have plenty of American problems to deal with. And since I don't have the license to talk about that, I'll let others talk about that.
Listen, if I can just make one comment that's sort of peripheral here. If you look at why Americans, and we all know Americans are poor, weak creatures, but if you look at why Americans are suspicious of China now, you can point to a couple of immediate things if you're trying to figure out, okay, what would be a good move. South China Sea. It was very corrupting. of the notion of good Chinese intentions working with international system. Taiwan. I mean, you know, how does that help China to threaten Taiwan? All of these things have influenced the way Americans perceive Chinese intentions. And I think to roll back some of those sort of more aggressive militant postures, which actually don't serve any huge Chinese national interests, except possibly to propitiate certain sort of internal demands, I think would help us restore the balance. And I don't think, though, that that's in the cards. So it's with a certain sort of sense of, as I said earlier, a sense of tragedy that I watch this thing, because I don't see the capacity and the flexibility within both sides to roll back some of the areas from which I view the threats as eminent.
So we have time for probably one or two more. There was one here, and then just in the back there. Sorry, thank you.
Is the microphone, yeah,
Mike up here, just thanks.
Mr. Schell, you once wrote that the greatness of Mao was that he was big enough and mean enough to break the cake of custom. And Professor Vogel, you've delivered a similar statement, perhaps on a somewhat lesser level, with respect to Mr. Deng. Where, considering the hardening of the cake of custom at this point in China, do you see a leader coming from?
Ezra? They don't have presidential debates like we do. And I think it's very hard to tell. But I do think that I know a lot of able Chinese officials. Kennedy School at Harvard had a program for about 15 years where Chinese officials came for a period of months and met with our professors and talked about all kinds of issues. And they are smart, they're well informed, they're a very broad base. I think there are a lot of Chinese leaders, you know, whether they will be given the opportunity and whether together, whether Xi takes a third term or whether he just recently has made a comment, there's a comment that appeared in the press in China that sounds like they want to have the freedom to choose their own leader and to pass on the leadership from one generation to another. And that's what a really good democratic country like China should do. So I think that gives hope that they may be looking for someone else, if not the next term, certainly by the following term. And I think we have to hope that of all the wise, experienced leaders, they have a very good program for training leaders. You go from the local level up to the provincial level, up to the national level. You have the people who come to have negotiations with the United States. What an extraordinary breadth, not only the English language, but the knowledge, the experience that they have. It's almost embarrassing when some of our officials who have so little understanding of China meet with them. And so I think that China has done quite a good job of training leaders. So we just have to, although we can't guess who it is or where they're going to find them, I think there are the people that have the capacity to provide that leadership.
You know, if you had said to me in 1975 when I was up on a mountain in Shanxi province spreading compost on this youth work delegation I was on, that in a matter of a couple of years, Deng Xiaoping, who had been consigned to a footnote in history, would be back. Mao would be dead, the Cultural Revolution would be overturned, and Deng Xiaoping would have initiated his agenda of reform and opening. I would have thought you were bereft of your senses. There was not a scintilla of evidence to suggest that anything like that could happen, that China had any leader that could ever oppose Mao or Maoism, and yet it happened. So you have to look at China, I think, in a way that it is a country that is constantly reinventing itself. It's still probing and experimenting and casting around for a way to be in the world. every time where we are, in a moment, we forget that history is moving. And we think this is it. This is the freeze point. This is what we're going to get for eternity. And it turns out not to be true. So as a historian, I just urge you to sort of remember what Ezra said a few minutes ago, that history does change, and it will change. And China is a very contradictory place, riddled with all sorts of contention. And you don't see it because it doesn't allow you to see it clearly, but it's there. And it will reappear in some other guise.
So we're almost just at the end, but I promised this gentleman in the white shirt in the way back there that he would have his shot.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Hello. Thanks a lot for the panelist discussion today. I have a question that is sort of probably not going to get the exact answer yes or no, and that's not the answer that I'm looking for. This is a question that, we understand our conversation today is more framed on having a discussion on where the two countries' relationship can go forward. But at the end of the day, our title of discussion is China the enemy. So, and also understand that we're not making any foreign affairs policy type of speculations. But would you see there's a possibility that, referring back to the metaphor of Greek tragedy, that the two countries, seeing so much of economic impasses and seeing so much of increasing clashing of culture and different things, that would eventually lead into a Cold War-ish proxy war, like what Soviet Union has done to the U.S. Through Cuba, and maybe somewhere through Southeast China Sea or some other geographical locations. Would you see that as a possibility to entertain, or you wouldn't even think that's a conversation worth having at all, seeing so much intricacy of the two countries have already
So who sees a Cold War on the horizon?
I think there's a real danger of a Cold War, and all the pieces are in place if a lot of the candidates in Washington begin talking that way. The next administration could pursue that, and China could also go in that direction. That's why I think it's so important for all of us who don't want it to go that way. And just as Orville said, that China can change. We have new administrations, we have presidential elections, and I think there is a good opportunity for a new administration. I personally find it hard to see the structure in our current administration, where we have the expertise and the wisdom and the perspective and the consistency and the organizational system to make really profound changes forward. But we have new administrations in the United States, and we can maintain hope.
I mean, I think it's a toss-up now about whether we're going to head into a more sort of intractable Cold War. And of course, what I fear most of all is that something even worse could happen, whether in the South China Sea or Taiwan. And then we would be not only off to the races, but sadly, it would be the end of China's economic miracle, which is profound and quite astounding. And I think that is the thing that perplexes me more than anything, of how, having accomplished such an extraordinary and unimaginable accomplishment as China has, economically speaking, could that get put at risk over, you have to ask yourself, over what? The United States is not actually an enemy. So what's going on here? It's very mysterious. And it has to do, I think, with deep and abiding suspiciousness on both sides, and the question of intentions, and different systems and values. There are many things that play into it, and it's unraveling. And nobody has a counter scenario for how to pull it back together yet. And that's where leaders are important. I don't see any of the Democrats talking about this.
So Dinda gets the last question, the last word.
No,
the last word.
Question. I just want to say, I think we all agree that the sweep of history, that these brilliant thinkers bring to the stage is absolutely extraordinary. And we are so grateful to all of you. Orville, thank you so much for joining us straight off the plane from China. Ezra, you're still my hero, and thank you so much for everything you've shared with us tonight. And Joe, thank you so much for doing such a great job moderating. Thank you.
진짜